The sun bled across the Montana sky, turning everything it touched to gold as Zeke Blackwood rode into Cottonwood Springs on his dusty Palomino. The year was 1876, and the West was still wild, still unforgiving to those who didn't understand its cruel beauty. Zeke understood it well enough. 6 years of driving cattle across 3 territories had taught him the language of the land, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to find water where none seemed to exist, and how to survive when the odds turned against you. The town was small, barely a scratch on the landscape, but it boasted a general store, a saloon, and enough civilization to warrant a stop after 3 weeks on the trail. His saddlebags were light, his canteen nearly empty, and his spirit worn thin from too many nights under the stars with only his horse for company. As he dismounted in front of the general store, stretching his legs and working the stiffness from his back, he heard a sound that didn't belong among the typical noises of a frontier town. A soft, broken sobbing coming from the narrow alley between the store and the neighboring building. Zeke hesitated, his hand resting on his saddle horn. He had learned long ago that other people's troubles were best left alone, but something in those muffled cries pulled at him, made him secure his horse to the hitching post with more care than necessary as he debated what to do. With a sigh that spoke of his better judgment being ignored, he walked toward the sound, his spurs jingling with each step, the only announcement of his approach. She sat on an overturned crate, her body curled forward, face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with each sob, and her honey-brown hair had come loose from its pins to curtain her face. Her dress, once fine but now travel-worn and dusty, suggested she wasn't from these parts. "Madam," Zeke kept his voice low, gentle, like he was approaching a spooked horse. "You all right?" The woman's head snapped up, revealing a tear-streaked face that, despite its current distress, was striking in its beauty. Her eyes were the color of spring sage, rimmed red from crying and filled with a mix of surprise and embarrassment at being discovered. She struggled to compose herself, hastily wiping her cheeks. "I'm fine, thank you." Zeke knew a lie when he heard one. He'd told enough of them himself. "No offense, madam, but you don't look fine." She attempted a smile that crumbled before it could fully form. Fresh tears welled in her eyes, and she covered her face with her hands again, as if she could hide her sorrow from the world, or at least from this stranger who had found her. Without thinking, Zeke closed the distance between them. He knelt before her, his calloused hands gently taking hold of hers, drawing them away from her face. Her skin was soft beneath his rough touch, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd had any gentle human contact. "Sometimes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it helps to tell your troubles to someone who doesn't know you. No judgment, no history, just words floating away on the wind." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a connection neither expected. Then, with a tenderness that surprised even himself, Zeke raised her hands to his lips and placed a gentle kiss on her knuckles, tasting the salt of her tears. "Name's Zeke Blackwood," he said, "and I've got nowhere to be and nothing but time." "Harriet," she replied after a moment, her voice steadying. "Harriet Montgomery," and so began the story that would change both their lives forever. Harriet Montgomery had come west with dreams as vast as the prairie sky. The daughter of a Boston banker, she had been raised in privilege, but had always yearned for something more than the confined life of a society woman. When she married William Hayes, a charming entrepreneur with promises of building a new life in the West, she thought she had found her escape. "He had such plans," Harriet explained as she and Zeke sat on the porch of the town's small boarding house later that evening. "A cattle ranch in Montana, a place where we could build something from nothing." Her fingers traced patterns on the cup of coffee Zeke had bought her. "I believed him. I believed everything." The setting sun cast long shadows across the dirt street as townspeople made their way home for the evening. Zeke remained silent, giving her the space to continue her story. 2 months ago, we arrived in Helena. William went to secure our land claim while I stayed in town. He was supposed to return in 3 days. She looked up at Zeke, her eyes reflecting the dying light. "He never came back. Did you look for him?" Zeke asked. Already knowing the answer, Harriet nodded. Everyone in Helena helped. The sheriff organized search parties. They found his horse near the river, but no sign of William. Her voice caught. After a month, they declared him presumed dead, likely drowned crossing the river. "I'm sorry," Zeke said, meaning it. "That's not the worst of it." Harriet's grip tightened on her cup. "Yesterday, I discovered that William had gambled away everything we had. Our savings, my inheritance, even the money for the land claim, it was all gone. The bank in Helena showed me the withdrawals. He'd been visiting gambling halls for weeks before he disappeared." Zeke understood now why he had found her crying. She had lost not only her husband but her future, her security, everything she had come west to build. "I have exactly $23 to my name," she continued, "and nowhere to go. I can't return to Boston, my pride won't allow it. My parents warned me against William, against this whole adventure." A bitter laugh escaped her. "They'll say they told me so, and they'd be right." The lamplight from inside the boarding house cast a warm glow as darkness settled over the town. Somewhere down the street, a piano played in the saloon, the notes drifting on the evening breeze. "What will you do now?" Zeke asked. Harriet looked out at the darkening town, determination gradually replacing the despair in her eyes. "Find work, I suppose. Save enough for a stage ticket to San Francisco. I've heard there are opportunities for educated women there, teaching positions, perhaps." Zeke considered her words, considering as well the strange twist of fate that had brought him to this alley, to this woman, on this particular day. He had been drifting for years, taking jobs as they came, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. Perhaps it was time for that to change. "I might have another option for you," he said carefully. "I'm headed to a place called Silverwater Valley, about 4 days' ride from here. The Donovan Ranch is looking for hands for the season, and Mrs. Donovan mentioned needing help with their 3 young ones." "You're suggesting I go with you?" Harriet looked at him with surprise. "You don't even know me." "I know you're in trouble and need honest work," Zeke replied. "And I know the Donovans are good people who pay fair. It wouldn't be permanent, but it would give you time to decide your next move, and you'd have a roof over your head and food on your plate." Harriet studied him, trying to discern his motives. "Why would you help me like this?" Zeke shrugged, uncomfortable with the question. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be alone with nowhere to turn." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "Think about it tonight. I'm leaving at first light. If you want to come along, meet me at the livery stable." As he walked away, Zeke questioned his own actions. Taking a woman he barely knew on a 4-day journey across open country wasn't something he would normally consider. But there was something about Harriet Montgomery that had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't explain, a strength beneath her sorrow, a resilience that called to him. That night, as he lay on his bedroll in the livery stable, too frugal to spend money on a proper room, Zeke found himself hoping she would be there in the morning. Dawn broke cold and clear, the sky lightening from indigo to pale blue as Zeke saddled his horse. He had just finished securing his bedroll when he heard footsteps approaching. Turning, he saw Harriet walking toward him, a small carpetbag in one hand, wearing a practical traveling outfit that had replaced yesterday's finer dress. "I've decided to accept your offer," she said without preamble. "But I want to make something clear, I'll earn my keep. I'm not looking for charity." Zeke nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Wouldn't have expected anything less, Mrs. Montgomery." "Miss," she corrected him. "Or Harriet, if you prefer. I don't feel much like a missus anymore." "Harriet, then," Zeke agreed. "Can you ride?" "I grew up riding in Boston, though I imagine Western riding is quite different. You'll learn," Zeke said, turning to the stable owner who had just emerged from the back room. "Joe, we'll need a horse for the lady, something gentle but with stamina." 2 hours later, they were on the trail, leaving Cottonwood Springs behind. Harriet sat tall in the saddle of a dappled mare named Daisy, her carpetbag and a few supplies Zeke had helped her purchase secured behind her. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. "It's beautiful," Harriet said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them as they rode. "I never imagined it would be so vast." Zeke glanced at her, noting how the sunlight caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold. "This is just the beginning. Wait until you see the valley." As they traveled, Zeke found himself sharing stories of his life on the trail the cattle drives from Texas to Montana, the characters he'd met along the way, the times he'd nearly lost his life to storms or rustlers or his own foolishness. Harriet listened intently, asking questions that showed a genuine interest and intelligence. In return, she told him about growing up in Boston, the daughter of a man who had made his fortune in shipping. She spoke of attending lectures at the Athenaeum, of her love for literature and art, and of how she had always dreamed of seeing the world beyond the confines of society. "William promised me adventure," she said as they made camp the first night. "I suppose in a way he delivered." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the rocky outcropping that sheltered their camp. Zeke handed her a tin plate of beans and salt pork. "Not exactly what they serve at Boston dinner parties," he apologized. Harriet took the plate with a genuine smile. "After today's ride, it looks like a feast." She took a bite and closed her eyes appreciatively. "And tastes like one too." Zeke watched her across the fire, this woman who had lost everything yet still found reasons to smile. She was adapting to trail life better than he had expected, never complaining about the hard ride or the simple accommodations. There was a resilience to her that impressed him. "Tomorrow we'll reach the Carson River," he said, finishing his own meal. "The crossing can be tricky this time of year with the spring melt, but I know a safe ford." "I trust you," Harriet said simply, and the words settled in Zeke's chest with unexpected weight. Trust was a rare commodity in his world. Most of the men he'd ridden with kept their backs to the wall and one eye open, even among friends. Yet here was this woman who had known him for barely a day, placing her safety in his hands without hesitation. That night, as Harriet slept wrapped in the extra blanket he'd insisted she take, Zeke stayed awake longer than usual, watching the stars wheel overhead and wondering about the strange turns life could take. A week ago, he had been alone, as he had been for years. Now he found himself responsible for someone else's welfare, someone who was quickly becoming more than just a traveling companion in need. The next morning brought challenges neither had anticipated. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as they broke camp, and by mid-morning, the first drops of rain began to fall. Soon, it was a steady downpour that turned the trail to mud and soaked through their clothing despite the oilskin slickers Zeke had packed. "We need to find shelter." Zeke called over the driving rain. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles east of here. We can wait out the worst of it there." Harriet nodded, water streaming down her face as she followed him off the main trail and into a stand of pine trees. The going was slower here, the horses carefully picking their way through the underbrush. When they finally reached the line shack, a crude, one-room structure built by cattlemen for use during roundups, it was past noon, and both were chilled to the bone. The cabin was dusty and had clearly been abandoned for some time, but it was dry and had a stone fireplace. "It's not much," Zeke said as he helped Harriet dismount, noticing how she winced at the movement. "But it will keep us out of the rain." While Harriet explored the small cabin, Zeke tended to the horses, setting them up under the lean-to attached to the side of the shack. By the time he entered the cabin, Harriet had swept out the worst of the dust and was attempting to light a fire with the few dry pieces of wood stacked beside the hearth. "Let me," Zeke said, kneeling beside her. Their hands brushed as she handed over the matches, and he couldn't help but notice how cold her fingers were. "You're freezing." "I'll be fine once the fire's going," she assured him, but her teeth chattered as she spoke. Zeke worked quickly, arranging the kindling and coaxing a small flame to life. As the fire grew, filling the small space with warmth and light, he turned to find Harriet still shivering, her wet clothes clinging to her frame. "You need to get out of those wet things," he said, then quickly added, "I'll step outside while you change." "Into what?" Harriet asked with a small laugh. "Everything I own is in that carpet bag and it's as soaked as I am." Zeke frowned, then moved to his own saddlebags, which had been better protected by his slicker. He pulled out a clean shirt and a pair of wool socks. "They'll be too big, but they're dry," he said, offering them to her. "I'll wait outside. Hang your wet things by the fire to dry." Before she could protest, he stepped back into the rain, closing the door firmly behind him. He busied himself checking on the horses again, making sure they had shelter from the worst of the storm. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and Zeke realized they would likely be spending the night in the line shack. After giving Harriet what he hoped was enough time to change, Zeke knocked on the door. "Decent?" "Yes, come in," came the reply. He entered to find Harriet seated by the fire, her wet clothes spread over the room's single chair to dry. She wore his shirt, which hung almost to her knees, and the wool socks. Her hair, freed from its pins, cascaded down her back in damp waves. Zeke tried not to stare, but it was difficult. Even in his oversized clothing, with her face scrubbed clean of traveled dust by the rain, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "Thank you for the clothes," Harriet said, seeming unaware of his thoughts. "I feel much better now." Zeke cleared his throat. "Good, that's good." He moved to the other side of the fire, putting some distance between them. "Looks like we'll be here for the night. Storm's not letting up." Harriet nodded, gazing into the flames. "I've been thinking about what awaits at the Donovan ranch," she said after a moment. "You mentioned they have children?" "3," Zeke confirmed, grateful for the change in subject. "2 boys and a girl, all under 10. Mrs. Donovan has her hands full with the house and the garden, and Mr. Donovan mentioned they could use someone to teach the children their letters and numbers." "I could do that," Harriet said, a note of excitement entering her voice. "I taught at a small school in Boston for a year before I married William. I enjoyed it very much." "Why'd you stop?" Zeke asked, curious. Harriet's expression clouded. "William didn't think it was appropriate for his wife to work. He said it reflected poorly on his ability to provide." She sighed. "I gave up many things to be the wife he wanted." The fire popped and sparked, filling the silence that followed her words. Outside, the rain continued to drum on the roof, creating a cocoon of isolation around them. "What about you?" Harriet asked suddenly. "Have you always been a cowboy?" Zeke shook his head. "Grew up on a small farm in Missouri. My pa grew corn and raised a few head of cattle. Ma died when I was 12 and Pa followed 5 years later. Farm went to pay their debts." He shrugged, uncomfortable with sharing so much of himself. "Drifted west after that, picked up work where I could, found I had a knack for handling cattle. No wife, no family of your own." Harriet pressed gently. "No." Zeke's tone made it clear that particular topic was closed. Harriet respected his boundaries and changed the subject. They talked late into the evening, the conversation flowing more easily than either expected. She told him about her favorite books, and he shared stories of the most beautiful places he'd seen in his travels. They discovered a shared love of music, though Harriet admitted she played piano only passably, and Zeke confessed his singing voice scared the cows. As night fell and the small cabin grew dim except for the glow of the fire, Zeke realized he hadn't enjoyed someone's company this much in years. Harriet was intelligent, thoughtful, and possessed a quiet sense of humor that surprised him. She listened when he spoke and asked questions that showed she was genuinely interested in his answers. When it came time to sleep, Zeke insisted Harriet take the cabin's narrow cot while he made do with his bedroll on the floor. She protested, but he was firm. "I've slept on the ground more nights than I can count," he told her. "One more won't hurt me." As they settled in for the night, the rain still pattering on the roof, Harriet's voice came softly through the darkness. "Zeke, thank you not just for today but for finding me yesterday. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." Zeke stared up at the ceiling, something warm and unfamiliar expanding in his chest. "Get some sleep, Harriet. We've got a long ride tomorrow if the rain lets up." The storm passed during the night, and they woke to a world washed clean, the morning sun turning raindrops on pine needles into diamonds. The trail was muddy but passable, and they made good time despite the conditions. By late afternoon of the fourth day, they crested a ridge to reveal Silverwater Valley spread out below them, a wide expanse of green pasture surrounded by forested hills, with a silver ribbon of river winding through it. Scattered along the valley floor were several ranches, identifiable by their clusters of buildings and the herds of cattle grazing nearby. "It's breathtaking," Harriet said, reining in beside Zeke to take in the view. "That's the Donovan place." Zeke pointed to a ranch on the eastern side of the valley, distinguished by its white painted fences and large red barn. "Best water rights in the valley and some of the finest grazing land." As they rode down into the valley, Harriet grew quiet and Zeke sensed her nervousness. "They're good people," he assured her. "Frank Donovan is fair and honest, and his wife Sarah has a kind heart. They'll treat you well." Harriet nodded, straightening her shoulders. "I'm ready." The Donovans welcomed them with the easy hospitality of those accustomed to visitors arriving after long journeys. Frank, a burly man with a booming voice and a red beard streaked with gray, clasped Zeke's hand warmly. Sarah, petite but sturdy with laugh lines around her eyes, ushered them inside for a hot meal while their 3 children Jacob, Daniel, and Emma darted around with the boundless energy of youth. Over dinner, Zeke explained how he had met Harriet and her situation. The Donovans exchanged a look Zeke couldn't quite interpret. "Well," Frank said finally, "we do need someone to help with the children's schooling, and Sarah could use an extra pair of hands around the house." He looked at Harriet kindly. "If you're willing to work hard, Miss Montgomery, we'd be pleased to have you stay with us." "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," Harriet said, relief evident in her voice. "I promise I won't disappoint you." Later, after Harriet had been shown to the small room off the kitchen that would be hers, Zeke found himself alone with Frank on the front porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like spilled sugar. "She seems like a fine woman," Frank said, lighting his pipe. "Been through a rough time by the sound of it." "She has," Zeke agreed, "but she's stronger than she looks." Frank studied him through a cloud of pipe smoke. "Planning to stay on for the season like we discussed," Zeke nodded, "if the offer still stands." "It does." Frank tamped down the tobacco in his pipe. "Bunkhouse is yours for as long as you want it. We start moving the herd to summer pasture next week." Zeke thanked him and headed for the bunkhouse, where he would be staying alone until the other seasonal hands arrived. As he walked, he glanced back at the main house, seeing a light still burning in Harriet's window. He wondered what she was thinking on her first night in her new home. For his part, Zeke was thinking that Silverwater Valley might be a good place to stay for a while. The work was honest, the pay fair, and for the first time in years he felt the pull to remain in one place. He told himself it was the beauty of the valley, the decency of the Donovans, the prospect of steady work. But as his gaze lingered on that single lighted window, he knew there was another reason entirely. The days stretched into weeks, and spring bloomed fully across Silverwater Valley. Harriet quickly settled into life at the Donovan Ranch, proving herself invaluable with the children, who took to her immediately. Every morning after breakfast and the morning chores, she would gather Jacob, Daniel, and Emma in the small room Frank had set aside as a schoolroom and teach them reading, writing, arithmetic, and history. In the afternoons, she helped Sarah with household tasks or tended the kitchen garden. Evenings were spent around the family table, sharing the day's events and often ending with Harriet reading aloud from one of the books she had discovered in the ranch's modest library. Zeke, meanwhile, worked from sunrise to sunset alongside Frank and the other ranch hands who had arrived. They moved cattle to summer pasture, mended fences, broke horses, and performed the countless other tasks necessary to keep a working ranch operating smoothly. It was hard, physical work, but Zeke found satisfaction in it. He saw Harriet mainly at mealtimes when all the hands ate at the main house, or on Sundays when work slowed, and the family attended the small church in nearby Silverwater, the town that gave the valley its name. Their interactions were friendly but brief, both of them busy with their respective duties. Yet Zeke found himself looking forward to those moments, to the way Harriet's face lit up when she spoke of something the children had learned, or how she would sometimes catch his eye across the dinner table and give him a small smile that seemed meant just for him. One Sunday in early June, after church services, most of the valley's residents gathered for a picnic by the river. It was a tradition, Sarah explained to Harriet, to celebrate the end of spring planting and cattle moving. There was music and dancing, food spread on long tables, and children running freely through the meadow. Zeke, who normally avoided such social gatherings, found himself attending at Frank's insistence. He stood at the edge of the festivities, nursing a cup of lemonade and watching as Harriet helped organize games for the children. "She's fitting in well," Frank said, appearing beside him. "Sarah says she's never seen the children take to learning so eagerly." Zeke nodded. "She has a way about her." Frank gave him a knowing look. "You know, she asks about you, what you're doing, how you're finding the work." Zeke felt a warmth creep up his neck that had nothing to do with the June sun. "Does she now?" Frank confirmed, hiding a smile. "Might be worth asking her to dance. Music's starting up." Sure enough, several of the local men had brought instruments, a fiddle, a guitar, a mouth organ, and were tuning up under a large oak tree. People were already clearing a space for dancing. Zeke hesitated, watching as Harriet finished a game with the children and sent them off to their parents. She wore a simple blue dress today, her hair partially pinned up but with curls escaping to frame her face. In the 2 months since he had found her crying in that alley, she had changed. There was color in her cheeks now, a lightness to her step, a confidence in her bearing that spoke of healing. Taking a deep breath, Zeke set down his cup and walked toward her. "Miss Montgomery," he said formally as he approached, conscious of the eyes of others upon them. "Would you care to dance?" Harriet looked up at him, surprise evident in her expression before it gave way to pleasure. "I would, Mr. Blackwood, thank you." He led her to the clearing where other couples were already moving to the lively tune. It had been years since Zeke had danced, and he warned her as much as he took her hand in his, placing his other hand lightly at her waist. "Just follow my lead," Harriet said with a smile. "I'll keep you from embarrassing yourself too badly." The music carried them, and Zeke found that his body remembered the steps better than he expected. Harriet moved gracefully, her hand warm in his, her eyes bright with enjoyment. As they turned and stepped in time to the fiddle's melody, the rest of the picnic seemed to fade away until it was just the two of them, moving together in perfect harmony. "You're not as rusty as you claimed," Harriet said as the song ended and they paused, slightly breathless. "I had a good partner," Zeke replied, reluctant to release her hand. The musicians struck up another tune, slower this time, and without asking, Zeke drew Harriet closer. She came willingly, her free hand resting on his shoulder as they began to move again. "I've barely seen you these past weeks," Harriet said softly. "How are you finding ranch life?" "It suits me," Zeke answered, surprised to realize how true it was. "The work is good, the company better. How about you? Are the Donovans treating you well?" "Very well," Harriet affirmed. "The children are a joy to teach, and Sarah has become a dear friend. I feel useful here, needed." Zeke looked down at her, noting the contentment in her expression. "You've changed since Cottonwood Springs." "For the better, I hope," she said with a small laugh. "Definitely for the better," Zeke assured her. "You were beautiful even when you were crying, but you're radiant when you smile." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and he immediately wished he could take them back. It was too forward, too personal, but Harriet didn't seem offended. Instead, a blush rose to her cheeks, and her eyes, when they met his, held a warmth that made his heart skip. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the compliment and for everything else. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for helping me when you had no reason to." "I had reason enough," Zeke said quietly. The music ended, and they stood for a moment, still close, until the sound of someone clearing their throat nearby broke the spell. They stepped apart, both suddenly aware of the curious glances being cast their way. The rest of the afternoon passed pleasantly, with more dancing, games, and conversation. Zeke found himself seeking out Harriet's company whenever possible, and she seemed equally inclined to stay near him. By the time the sun began to set and families started packing up to head home, something had shifted between them, a recognition of feelings that had been growing since that rainy day in the lined shack. As they rode back to the ranch, Harriet on her mare beside the wagon carrying the Donovan children who had fallen asleep after the day's excitement, she and Zeke fell naturally into conversation about the picnic, the people they had met, the music they had enjoyed. "Would you like to go riding tomorrow?" Zeke asked suddenly. "It's my day off, and there's a place up in the hills I think you'd enjoy. We could bring a picnic lunch." Harriet looked surprised but pleased. "I'd like that. I haven't explored much beyond the ranch and town." "I'll saddle the horses after breakfast," Zeke promised. That night, as he lay in his bunk in the quiet bunkhouse, Zeke found himself looking forward to the morning with an eagerness he hadn't felt in years. He was falling for Harriet Montgomery, had been falling since the moment he found her crying into her hands. It was foolish, perhaps. She was educated, refined, from a world so different from his own, and she was still healing from the betrayal of her husband. But as sleep finally claimed him, Zeke decided that for once in his life he wouldn't run from his feelings. He would see where this path led, even if it meant risking his heart. The next morning dawned clear and warm, a perfect day for riding. After breakfast, while Harriet packed a lunch, Zeke saddled their horses and checked that his canteen was full. By mid-morning they were riding away from the ranch, following a trail that wound up into the hills surrounding the valley. Harriet rode confidently now, having spent the past 2 months improving her skills whenever time allowed. She had exchanged her Boston riding habits for more practical Western attire, a split skirt that allowed her to ride astride, a sturdy blouse, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect her fair skin from the sun. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked as they climbed higher, the trail narrowing as it passed through a stand of aspen trees, their leaves shimmering in the breeze. "There's a meadow about an hour's ride from here," Zeke explained. "Best wildflowers in the territory and a view of the entire valley." The trail grew steeper, and conversation lapsed as they focused on navigating the terrain. Zeke led the way, occasionally glancing back to make sure Harriet was managing the ascent. She followed steadily, her face flushed with exertion but her eyes bright with excitement. When they finally emerged from the trees into the meadow Zeke had promised, Harriet gasped. It was a natural clearing on the mountainside, carpeted with wildflowers in every color imaginable: blue lupines, orange California poppies, purple asters, and dozens of others Harriet couldn't name. Beyond the meadow, the land fell away sharply, providing a spectacular view of Silverwater Valley spread out below, the river gleaming in the sunlight. "Oh, Zeke," Harriet breathed, reining in her horse to take in the scene. "It's magnificent." Zeke dismounted and came to help her down, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her easily from the saddle. "Thought you might like it." They secured the horses where they could graze on the lush meadow grass, then spread a blanket Harriet had packed among the wildflowers. The picnic lunch was simple cold chicken, bread, cheese, and apple tarts Sarah had insisted they take but eaten in such surroundings. It seemed like a feast. As they ate, they talked easily, the conversation flowing from topic to topic. Harriet spoke of her plans to expand the children's education, perhaps to include some of the neighboring ranch children if the Donovans agreed. Zeke shared his growing interest in horse breeding, an area Frank had encouraged him to explore given his skill with the animals. "You're thinking of staying on then?" Harriet asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Beyond the season, Zeke looked out over the valley, considering his answer. "I am," he said finally. "Never thought I'd say this, but I can see a future here." "What kind of future?" Harriet pressed gently. Zeke turned to her, his expression serious. One with roots, maybe a place of my own someday, a small spread, nothing fancy, just somewhere that's mine. He paused, gathering his courage. And maybe someone to share it with. The air between them seemed to still, heavy with unspoken feelings. Harriet's eyes met his, searching. Zeke, she began, but whatever she was about to say was interrupted by a distant rumble. Both looked up to see dark clouds gathering over the mountains to the west, moving quickly in their direction. "Storm's coming," Zeke said, standing and offering his hand to help Harriet up. "We should head back." They packed up hastily, and Zeke helped Harriet mount before swinging into his own saddle. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as they entered the tree line, the trail already growing slick with moisture. "Stay close," Zeke called back to Harriet as the rain intensified. "The trail gets tricky in weather like this." They rode carefully, the horses picking their way down the increasingly muddy path. Thunder boomed overhead and lightning flashed, illuminating the forest in stark white bursts. Harriet's mare grew nervous, sidestepping and tossing her head at each thunderclap. "Easy, Daisy," Harriet soothed, stroking the horse's neck with a wet hand. "It's all right, girl." They were about halfway down the mountain when disaster struck. A particularly loud crack of thunder spooked Daisy, who reared suddenly, nearly unseating Harriet. As the mare came down, her back hoof slipped on the muddy trail, and she lost her footing entirely, sliding toward the edge of the path where the mountainside fell away steeply. Harriet cried out, clinging to the saddle as Daisy scrambled for purchase. Zeke reacted instantly, leaping from his horse and lunging for Daisy's bridle. He caught it just as the mare's hindquarters went over the edge, her back legs churning frantically in the air. "Jump," Zeke shouted to Harriet. Now, Harriet didn't hesitate. She flung herself from the saddle toward Zeke, who caught her with his free arm even as he struggled to hold onto the panicking horse. For a terrible moment, they teetered on the edge of the trail, all three in danger of going over. Then Zeke released the bridle, using both arms to pull Harriet to safety as Daisy slid over the edge with a terrified whinny. They fell backward onto the trail, Harriet landing on top of Zeke, both of them muddy and breathless. "Daisy," Harriet cried, scrambling to look over the edge. The mare had slid about 20 feet down the steep slope before coming to rest against a cluster of young pine trees. She was on her side, still moving but clearly injured. "She's alive," Zeke said, peering over the edge beside Harriet, "but she's hurt bad. Stay here." Despite Harriet's protests, Zeke began carefully making his way down the slope to the injured horse. The rain had eased slightly, but the ground was treacherous, and several times he nearly lost his footing. When he reached Daisy, he ran his hands over her legs and body, assessing the damage. "Her leg's broken," he called up to Harriet, his voice tight, "and she's cut up pretty bad." Harriet's hand flew to her mouth. "Can you help her?" Zeke didn't answer immediately. He stroked Daisy's neck, murmuring to her softly as the rain fell around them. Then he stood and made his way back up to the trail. His expression told Harriet everything before he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "There's nothing we can do for her except end her suffering." Tears filled Harriet's eyes, mingling with the rain on her face. "Are you sure?" "Couldn't we get help, bring someone back?" Zeke shook his head. "By the time we got back to the ranch and returned with help, she'd have suffered for hours, and with a broken leg like that, she'd never recover." He touched Harriet's arm gently. "I know it's hard, but it's the kindest thing." Harriet closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. "I understand." She reached for Zeke's hand, gripping it tightly. "Will you do it? I don't think I could." "Of course," Zeke said softly. "Wait here with my horse. I'll be back soon." He made his way down to Daisy again, his revolver heavy in his hand. Harriet turned away, unable to watch, but she heard the single shot that echoed through the trees despite the falling rain. When Zeke returned, his face was grim, his shirt soaked with rain and mud. Without a word, he pulled Harriet into his arms, holding her as she cried for the gentle mare who had carried her faithfully these past months. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her wet hair. "I'm so sorry, Harriet." Eventually, her tears subsided and she pulled back slightly, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "It wasn't your fault. You saved my life." Zeke's arms tightened around her. "When I saw you going over that edge, I thought." He couldn't finish the sentence, the fear still too raw. "I know," Harriet said softly. "I was scared too." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "But you were there, you caught me." The intensity in her eyes made Zeke's breath catch. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head until his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. But when Harriet's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer, it deepened into something more urgent, more honest, a confession of feelings too long held back. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, and not from the climb or the danger they had faced. Zeke rested his forehead against Harriet's, rain still falling around them, but neither noticing nor caring. "Been wanting to do that since I found you crying in that alley," he admitted. Harriet smiled, her first real smile since the accident. "I'm glad you finally did." The rain had lessened to a gentle drizzle, but they were both soaked through and miles from the ranch. "We need to get you home before you catch your death," Zeke said, reluctantly releasing her. "You'll have to ride with me." He helped her mount his horse, then swung up behind her, one arm secure around her waist as he took the reins with his free hand. Harriet leaned back against him, taking comfort in his solid presence as they began the slow journey back to the ranch. By the time they reached the Donovan place, the rain had stopped entirely and the sun was breaking through the clouds. Sarah rushed out to meet them, alerted by the sight of both riders on one horse. "What happened?" she demanded, helping Harriet down. "Are you hurt?" Zeke explained as he dismounted, telling of the storm, Daisy's fall, and the decision he had been forced to make. Sarah listened gravely, her arm around Harriet's shoulders. "You poor dears," she said when he finished. "Come inside, both of you. You need dry clothes and hot food." Later, after they had changed and eaten, Zeke found Harriet sitting alone on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and purple. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Sad about Daisy," Harriet admitted. "But grateful to be alive." She turned to look at him, her eyes serious. "And thinking about what you set up in the meadow before the storm, about seeing a future here." Zeke nodded, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand. "I meant it." "I've been thinking about my future too," Harriet said. "When I came west with William, I thought I knew what I wanted: adventure, a new beginning, a chance to build something of my own." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "After he disappeared, I felt lost, like all my dreams had vanished with him. But these past months at the ranch, working with the children, becoming part of this community, I've found purpose again." "You're good with those kids," Zeke said. "They adore you." "It's more than that," Harriet continued. "I've discovered that what I really wanted wasn't the adventure itself, but the freedom to choose my own path, to use my mind and my skills in ways that matter." She squeezed his hand. "And I've found something else I wasn't expecting." "What's that?" Zeke asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "Someone who sees me for who I am, not who he wants me to be." Harriet's voice was soft but certain. "Someone I could build a future with if he wanted that too." Zeke's heart pounded in his chest. He had never been good with words, especially when it came to matters of the heart. But looking at Harriet in the fading light, he knew he had to try. "I've spent my whole life drifting," he began slowly, "never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. After my parents died, I figured it was safer that way: no attachments, no one to lose, no one to disappoint." He took a deep breath. "But then I found you crying in that alley and something changed. For the first time in years, I wanted to stay somewhere, with someone." Harriet's eyes shone with unshed tears as she listened. "I'm not a wealthy man," Zeke continued. "Don't have much to offer except hard work and a heart that's yours if you want it. But I promise you this, Harriet Montgomery, if you choose me, I'll spend every day trying to make sure you never cry into your hands again. And if you do, I'll be there to kiss away the pain." A single tear slipped down Harriet's cheek, but she was smiling. "That sounds like a proposal, Zeke Blackwood." "I reckon it is," Zeke agreed, suddenly nervous. Not a very good one, but Harriet silenced him with a kiss, her hands framing his face. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with happiness. "It's a perfect proposal, and my answer is yes." Joy flooded through Zeke, so intense it almost hurt. He pulled Harriet into his arms, holding her close as if afraid she might disappear. "You're sure it won't be easy? We'd have to start small, save for our own place." "I don't need easy," Harriet said firmly. "I need real." "And what we have, Zeke, it's the most real thing I've ever known." The news of their engagement spread quickly through the valley. The Donovans were the first to offer congratulations, Sarah hugging Harriet tightly while Frank clapped Zeke on the shoulder with approval. The children were ecstatic, especially when Harriet assured them she would continue teaching them even after she was married. Frank offered Zeke a piece of land on the eastern edge of his property, a wedding gift, he called it. It wasn't large, but it had good water access and enough acreage to start a modest horse breeding operation, which had become Zeke's passion over the summer months. "You've proven yourself a hard worker and a good man," Frank told him. "The valley needs folks like you and Harriet putting down roots here." So as summer turned to autumn, Zeke began building a small house on their new land, with help from Frank and the other ranch hands. It was nothing fancy: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, but to Harriet, who visited the site every day to watch its progress, it was more beautiful than any Boston mansion. They were married on a crisp October day with all of Silverwater Valley in attendance. The ceremony took place in the small white church in town, which was filled to overflowing with well-wishers. Harriet wore a dress of ivory silk that Sarah had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Zeke, looking uncomfortable but handsome in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle on Frank's arm. The celebration afterward was held at the Donovan ranch, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns hanging from the trees. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and a sense of community that wrapped around the newlyweds like a warm blanket. As the evening wore on, Zeke found a moment to pull his bride away from the festivities, leading her to a quiet spot beneath an old oak tree. The music and laughter of the party drifted to them on the cool autumn breeze. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her into his arms. Harriet smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the light of the harvest moon overhead. "Completely, and you?" "More than I ever thought possible," Zeke admitted, still amazed that this remarkable woman had chosen him. "If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be a married man with land of my own by fall, I'd have called them crazy." "Life has a way of surprising us," Harriet said, resting her head against his chest. 6 months ago, I was at my lowest point, thinking my life was over before it had really begun, and then you found me." "Best thing I ever did," Zeke murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Harriet looked up at him, her expression suddenly serious. "I have something to tell you," she said. "A wedding gift of sorts, though I only found out for certain yesterday." Zeke raised an eyebrow, curious. "What is it?" Harriet took his hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. "In about 7 months, our little house is going to need that second bedroom." For a moment, Zeke stared at her, uncomprehending. Then understanding dawned and his face transformed with wonder. "A baby, we're having a baby," Harriet nodded, laughing at his expression. "We are you happy?" Instead of answering with words, Zeke lifted her off her feet, spinning her around with joy before setting her gently back on the ground. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Scared out of my mind, but happier than I've ever been." He kissed her then, pouring all his love and joy into the gesture. Harriet responded with equal fervor, her arms twining around his neck as she pressed close to him. When they finally broke apart, breathless and smiling, Zeke rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Harriet Blackwood," he whispered, savoring the sound of her new name. "And I love you, Zeke Blackwood," she replied. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come." Hand in hand, they walked back to their wedding celebration, stepping into their future together with hearts full of hope and the promise of a love that had begun with tears, but would be filled with joy. Spring came to Silverwater Valley in a riot of wildflowers and new life. The winter had been mild, allowing Zeke to make good progress on establishing their horse breeding operation. He had purchased 2 quality mares and arranged to use one of Frank's stallions for breeding, with the first foals expected the following year. The house was complete, cozy and welcoming with furniture they had either made themselves or purchased secondhand from families moving away. Harriet had planted a garden that was now sprouting tender green shoots, and she continued to teach the Donovan children 3 days a week, with the agreement that she would reduce her hours once the baby arrived. On a perfect May morning, with dawn just breaking over the eastern hills, Harriet went into labor. Zeke rode for the midwife in town, then paced the porch anxiously as the hours passed, periodically shooed outside by the midwife and Sarah Donovan, who had come to help. Finally, as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the cry of a newborn filled the small house. Zeke burst through the door to find Harriet propped up in their bed, tired but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your daughter," Harriet said, her voice filled with wonder. Zeke approached the bed as if in a dream, carefully sitting beside his wife and peering at the small, red face of his child. The baby's eyes were screwed shut, her tiny fists waving in the air as she tested her lungs with impressive vigor. "She's perfect," he breathed, reaching out a tentative finger to touch her cheek. "Just like her mother." Harriet leaned against him, exhausted but happier than she had ever been. "What shall we name her?" They had discussed names during the long winter evenings, sitting by the fire as snow fell outside, but had never settled on one. Now, looking at his daughter, Zeke knew. "Hope," he said softly, "because that's what she is, our hope for the future." Harriet smiled, the name feeling right. "Hope Elizabeth Blackwood," she added, incorporating her mother's name as a middle name. "Welcome to the world, little one." As Zeke looked at his wife and daughter, a wave of gratitude washed over him. From the moment he had found Harriet crying into her hands in that alley, to this perfect moment with their child between them, life had taken a turn he never could have imagined. He had found not just love but a purpose, a home, a family. And as he leaned down to kiss first his daughter's forehead and then his wife's lips, Zeke Blackwood knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. 10 years passed, bringing changes both great and small to the Blackwood family. Hope grew from a determined infant into a spirited young girl with her father's steady nature and her mother's quick mind. She was joined by 2 brothers, James, born 2 years after her, and Michael, who arrived 3 years later. Their small house expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Zeke adding rooms as needed, always with an eye to the future. The horse breeding business prospered beyond their expectations. Zeke had a natural talent for choosing and training quality stock, and word spread throughout the territory about the fine horses coming from Blackwood Ranch. They were able to purchase additional land adjoining their original plot, expanding their operation and their dreams. Harriet continued teaching, though on a more limited basis. She established a small school in town that met 3 days a week, where she taught not only the Donovan children but others from throughout the valley. The remaining days she devoted to her family and to keeping the ranch books, applying the financial acumen she had learned from her banker father to ensure their growing enterprise remained profitable. On a golden afternoon in late summer, as the 10th anniversary of the day they met approached, Zeke and Harriet sat on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard. Hope, now nearly 10, was teaching 7-year-old James and 5-year-old Michael how to lasso a fence post, her instructions precise and patient. "She's got your way with teaching," Zeke observed, his arm around Harriet's shoulders. Harriet smiled, leaning into his embrace. "And your stubbornness. Did you see how she kept at that difficult mare until she earned her trust?" just like her father. Zeke chuckled, watching as Hope demonstrated the proper technique again for her brothers. Hard to believe it's been 10 years since I found you crying in that alley. The best 10 years of my life, Harriet said softly, though I wouldn't have believed it possible that day. Nor I, Zeke agreed. I was just passing through same as always, never imagined I'd find my whole world in Cottonwood Springs. Harriet turned to look at him, her eyes as green and captivating as they had been a decade ago. Do you ever regret it? Stopping your wandering, settling down? Zeke met her gaze, his expression serious. Not for a single moment. Every morning I wake up beside you, I thank whatever twist of fate led me to that alley on that particular day. Harriet reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that 10 years of sun and laughter had etched around his eyes. I've been thinking lately about what might have happened if you hadn't found me that day, where I might have ended up. And, Zeke prompted, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. I think I would have survived, Harriet said thoughtfully, found work somewhere, made a life of sorts. But it would have been a shadow of what we've built together. She gestured to their children, their home, the thriving ranch that stretched around them. This is beyond anything I could have imagined for myself. Me too, Zeke admitted. I never thought I'd have a family of my own or land that was mine. Always figured I'd end up like most cowboys, old before my time, with nothing to show for my years but stories and scars. Harriet leaned up to kiss him, a gesture that still held the same sweetness and passion as their first kiss on that rain-soaked mountainside. I'm glad you found a different path. Found you mean, Zeke corrected with a smile. You're the one who changed everything. The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention to the road, where a rider was approaching at a leisurely pace. As the figure drew closer, they recognized Frank Donovan, now silver-haired but still robust. Evening Blackwoods. Frank called as he rode into the yard, dismounting with the ease of a man who had spent his life on horseback. The children abandoned their lassoing practice to rush toward him, knowing he usually carried candy in his pockets for just such occasions. Frank laughed, distributing peppermint sticks before making his way to the porch. To what do we owe the pleasure? Harriet asked, rising to greet him. Came to deliver some news and an invitation, Frank said, accepting the seat and glass of lemonade Harriet offered. Just got word that the railroad's finally coming through to Silverwater. Construction starts next spring. Zeke whistled low. That'll change things around here. For the better, I'm thinking, Frank said. Easier to get our cattle and horses to market, supplies coming in regular. Town's already talking about growth, new businesses, maybe even a proper school building. He glanced meaningfully at Harriet. Town council's hoping you might consider taking on a full-time teaching position when it's built. Harriet looked surprised but intrigued. A real school. With multiple classrooms, proper desks and books, Frank nodded. That's the plan. Council figures with the railroad coming will see an influx of families. Need someone with experience to oversee education in the valley. Someone respected. Zeke took Harriet's hand, squeezing it gently. Sounds like an opportunity worth considering. Harriet nodded slowly, ideas already forming. It would mean arranging things differently here at the ranch, but she looked at Zeke. Our children are getting older. Hope will be ready for more advanced studies soon. A proper school would benefit them too. Whatever you decide, you have my support, Zeke assured her. Always have, always will. Frank smiled at the exchange. No rush on a decision. School won't be built until next year at the earliest, but that brings me to the invitation part. Town's holding a celebration this Saturday, a sort of welcome to Progress Affair. Dancing, food, the usual. Sarah sent me specifically to make sure you'd all be there. Wouldn't miss it, Zeke said. Could use a night of celebration. After Frank departed, the family gathered for dinner in their cozy kitchen. As they ate, conversation flowed around plans for the town's celebration, the upcoming harvest, and Hope's latest achievement in her studies. Zeke sat at the head of the table, occasionally catching Harriet's eye and sharing a private smile that spoke of the deep bond between them. Later, after the children were tucked into bed and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Zeke and Harriet stood together on the porch, gazing up at the star-filled sky. A railroad, Harriet mused. When I think about how isolated this valley was when we first arrived. Progress comes even to the most remote places, Zeke said, his arms around her waist as she leaned back against his chest. But some things don't change. Like what? Harriet asked, tilting her head to look up at him. Like the way I feel about you, Zeke said simply. Stronger now than the day I married you, if that's possible. Harriet turned in his arms to face him, her expression tender. I feel the same. Sometimes I look at you across the room or watch you with the children, and I'm overwhelmed by how much I love you. Zeke lowered his head to kiss her, still marveling that this remarkable woman had chosen to build a life with him. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. You know, he said thoughtfully, I never imagined myself as a settled man with land and family and responsibilities. But now I can't imagine being anything else. You were always meant for this life, Harriet told him. You just needed someone to help you see it. Someone to cry into her hands so I could find her, Zeke teased gently. Harriet laughed, the sound as beautiful to him now as it had been the first time he heard it. I promise that was the last time you'll ever have to kiss away my tears of sorrow. Any tears from now on will be from happiness only. As if to seal that promise, Zeke kissed her again under the vast canopy of stars, surrounded by the home and life they had built together from nothing but hope and hard work, and a love that had begun in an unexpected moment of compassion. In the years that followed, Silverwater Valley prospered with the coming of the railroad, growing from a remote ranching community into a thriving small town. The Blackwood Ranch expanded accordingly, becoming known throughout the West for its quality horses. Zeke's breeding program, combined with Harriet's business acumen, created a legacy that would sustain their family for generations. Harriet did indeed become the headmistress of Silverwater's first proper school, shaping the education of the valley's children with the same care and dedication she had shown in teaching her own. Her reputation as an educator spread beyond the valley, and she was often consulted by other communities seeking to establish schools of their own. Their children grew into capable, compassionate adults who carried forward their parents' values of hard work, integrity, and service to community. Hope followed in her mother's footsteps, eventually taking over the school when Harriet retired. James expanded the family's horse breeding business, while Michael studied law and returned to serve as the town's first proper attorney. Through it all, Zeke and Harriet remained each other's cornerstone, their love deepening with each passing year. Even in their twilight years, with silver in their hair and lines of experience etched on their faces, they could often be found sitting together on the porch of the home they had built, hands intertwined, watching the sun set over the valley that had given them everything they'd ever truly needed. And sometimes, when asked by their grandchildren how their remarkable journey had begun, Zeke would smile at Harriet, his eyes still full of the same wonder and love they had held on that fateful day, and say simply, I found her crying into her hands until I took them and kissed away the pain. And in saving her, I found myself,